Don't make me laugh with that life or death nonsense. Who on earth dies just from making a little kimchi? These were the heartless words Beatrice and Clara hurled at Alara after they returned from a luxury spa retreat in Vermont. They had forced Alara to process over 300 heads of cabbage alone in the dead of winter, while she was battling a severe fever. After finding his wife collapsed and rushing her to the emergency room, Thomas finally reached his breaking point. In a fit of explosive rage, he grabbed a massive tub of red seasoning and flipped it over, splattering it across the yard. "Yes, I have lost my mind. Mother, if you are a human being, you simply cannot act this way," he screamed, his voice trembling with fury. "What kind of ending will this family's betrayal lead to? Stay with us to see how the sudden explosion of an only son changes everything. Thank you for visiting our channel for these life stories. Before we begin, please like and subscribe and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send positive energy your way. Now let us begin today's story. The winter in Boston did not arrive with a gentle whisper. It descended like a heavy iron curtain forged from Atlantic salt and ice. The fog, thick and gray as unwashed wool, clung to the red brick townhouses of Beacon Hill, swallowing the tops of the gas lamps and turning the morning sun into a pale, sickly smudge in the sky. It was a day where the air felt like needles against the skin, and the wind howled through the narrow alleys, carrying the scent of frozen earth and the distant, lonely tolling of church bells. Alara Harrison lay in the center of her mahogany four-poster bed, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Alara Harrison, a woman in her early 30s, once possessed of a vibrant, melodic laugh, now hollowed by years of quiet domestic service. She has kind, weary eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves. The fever was a cruel thief, stealing the strength from her limbs and replacing it with a rhythmic, pulsing ache that throbbed behind her eyes. For 7 days she had been the silent engine of the Harrison household. She had polished the silver until her fingers bled, basted turkeys until the heat of the oven felt like a permanent part of her skin, and smiled at dozens of distant relatives during the elaborate ancestor memorial week. To the Harrisons, tradition was not just a practice, it was a religion, and Alara was its primary sacrificial lamb. She forced herself to sit up, the world spinning in a nauseating tilt. The house was unnaturally quiet. Usually the morning was punctuated by the sharp rhythmic tapping of her mother-in-law's cane or the high-pitched demanding trill of her sister-in-law's voice. But today the silence was heavy, broken only by the groan of the old floorboards. With a trembling hand, she pulled a heavy wool robe over her nightgown and shuffled toward the kitchen. Her throat felt as though she had swallowed hot coals. She reached for the kettle, but her eyes were drawn to the back door, where a small white slip of paper was wedged firmly into the frame. She pulled it free. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and cold, the unmistakable script of Beatrice Harrison. Beatrice Harrison, the matriarch of the family, a woman of rigid posture and steel-gray hair who views vulnerability as a moral failing and tradition as an absolute law. Alara, the air in the city has become stifling. Clara and I have departed for the hot springs in Vermont to restore our spirits. It is a necessary retreat after such an exhausting week. Before we return in 3 days, you must process the shipment in the yard. 300 heads of cabbage, clean them, salt them, and prepare them for the winter ferment. Do not be idle. Do not waste what God has provided. The paper fluttered from Alara's hand. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to the backyard, and the sight that greeted her stole what little breath she had left. The yard, a manicured space that usually boasted expensive slate tiles and dormant rose bushes, was gone. In its place stood a literal wall of green. Crates upon crates were stacked high, containing 300 massive, frozen heads of Napa cabbage. They looked like a legion of silent, emerald ghosts huddled together in the Boston fog. Beside them sat mountain-high sacks of rock salt, tubs of garlic, and crates of ginger. It was a task for a team of 10, not a woman who could barely stand. Alara leaned against the doorframe, a bitter sob escaping her throat. This was the miracle Beatrice often spoke of, the miracle of hard labor. Alara closed her eyes, and for a moment, the fog of the fever transported her back 5 years. She remembered the day she had married Thomas Harrison, Having lost her own parents to a car accident just a year prior, she had walked into this family with a heart wide open, desperate for the warmth of a mother's touch and the safety of a sister's confidence. She had seen Beatrice's sternness as strength and Clara's spoiled whims as youthful spirit. She had thought she was finally home. Now, looking at the wall of vegetables that felt more like a fortress, she realized she was not a daughter. She was an asset, an unpaid, invisible laborer. She stepped out into the biting cold, her slippers instantly soaking through with icy dew. The scale of the work was a GD technique of cruelty, an emotion-based shock designed to break her spirit before she even began. She reached out and touched one of the cabbages. It was hard as stone, the outer leaves glazed with a thin sheen of frost. A sound suddenly pierced her consciousness. It wasn't the wind. It was a memory, sharp and jagged. She remembered a video Clara had taken on her phone during the memorial dinner a few days ago. Clara Harrison, a woman in her mid-20s with a porcelain complexion and a heart made of glass. She is pampered, vain, and possesses a sharp wit that she uses as a scalpel. In the memory, Clara's laughter rang out, a high, mocking sound as she filmed Ilara clumsily dropping a heavy serving tray. "Look at her! Mother, she's so slow, like a turtle in an apron." Beatrice's voice had followed, low and disapproving. "She must learn that the Harrison name is earned through service, not just a ring." That laughter echoed in the empty yard now, bouncing off the brick walls, mocking Ilara's fever, mocking her loneliness. It was the silent voice of her own suffering, a soul connection to a pain she had tried to ignore for years. The contrast was staggering. In Vermont, Beatrice and Clara would be wrapped in plush white robes, sipping herbal tea and soaking in mineral-rich waters. Here, in the gray shadow of a Boston winter, Ilara was expected to perform a miracle of endurance. Her hands began to shake, not just from the cold, but from a burgeoning, desperate spark of survival. She moved back into the kitchen and gripped the handle of her largest chef's knife. The steel was cold, grounding her. She looked at the first crate. She thought of her mother, who used to say that even the longest road begins with a single step. But her mother had never envisioned her daughter being treated like a beast of burden. With the knife in one hand and a bag of salt in the other, Ilara stepped back into the fog. The fever burned in her blood, making her vision swim, but she took a head of cabbage and sliced it down the middle. The sound of the crisp leaves yielding to the blade was the only music in the silent city. She was alone. She was sick. She was forgotten. But as she began the back-breaking work, a transformation hook was being set. She didn't know it yet, but this journey through pain was the beginning of her healing. She was the unlikely hero of her own story. A woman about to find her voice in the heart of a winter storm. One head down, 299 to go. The Boston fog had thickened into a suffocating shroud by midnight, clinging to the brick walls of the courtyard like a damp, spectral parasite. Ilara's world had shrunk to the yellow halo of the porch light and the rhythmic, agonizing sound of steel slicing through cabbage hearts. The fever was no longer just a heat in her blood. It had become a choir of voices, whispering doubts into her ears as the temperature of the night plummeted. Every time she bent over a crate, her spine screamed in protest, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain that radiated from her lower back to her skull. Her hands, soaked in brine and chilled by the frozen leaves, had turned a ghostly, mottled purple. She was no longer a woman. She was a machine of salt and sorrow, fueled by a terrifying, ingrained fear of the woman who would return in 2 days. Mrs. Martha Higgins, a widow from 3 houses down, possessing a crown of snowy curls and a heart as vast as the Atlantic. She is the neighborhood's unofficial guardian, always smelling faintly of lavender and fresh-baked bread. The heavy iron gate at the side of the house creaked, the sound piercing Ilara's delirium. Martha stood there, wrapped in a thick quilted coat, a thermos clutched in her mittened hands. She gasped, her breath hitching in the frozen air as she stared at the mountains of cabbage and the trembling woman standing amongst them. "Ilara, dear Lord, child, what are you doing?" Martha's voice was a frantic whisper. She rushed forward, catching Ilara's elbow just as the younger woman's knees began to buckle. "You're burning up. Your face is the color of a winter sunset. Stop this at once and come inside. Alara pulled away, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. I can't, Martha. Beatrice, she'll be back. She said not to be idle. She said it's a gift from God. This isn't a gift, Alara. This is a penance for a crime you didn't commit, Martha countered, her eyes flashing with a rare protective anger. Let me call my nephew. He can have this finished in an hour with a few of his friends. You need a doctor, not a salt tub. No! The word tore from Alara's throat, sharper than she intended. The fear of Beatrice's disapproval was a GD technique of psychological chains, a silent voice that drowned out even the logic of her own survival. If anyone else touches these, she'll know. She always knows. She'll say I'm weak. She'll say I don't deserve the Harrison name. Martha looked at the crates, then back at the fragile woman before her. Tradition shouldn't taste like blood, honey. This isn't how a family treats their own. As Martha was ushered out by Alara's frantic insistence, the silence returned, heavier than before. Alara's mind began to drift, the fever pulling her back to a sun-drenched kitchen in her childhood home. She could almost smell the cinnamon and apples. She saw her mother, her hands dusted with flour, smiling gently. Love is sacrifice, Alara, her mother's voice echoed in the chambers of her mind. It is the quiet strength of putting others before yourself. Alara leaned her forehead against a cold, wet crate, a tear tracing a hot path through the grime on her cheek. I'm trying, Mom, she whispered into the fog. I'm sacrificing everything. But why does it feel like I'm the only one on the altar? Is this love, or is this a slow suicide? She wondered if her mother had ever envisioned a sacrifice that required a woman to freeze her hands and break her back while those she served soaked in mineral baths. The transformation hook of her life was reaching a critical point, a journey from pain that was either going to lead to a miraculous change or a tragic end. The vibration in her robe pocket felt like an electric shock. With fumbling, numb fingers, she pulled out her phone. The caller ID read Thomas Harrison, Alara's husband, a man with a handsome, boyish face and a corporate disposition. He is a master of middle ground diplomacy, often mistaking his own passivity for kindness. Alara? Hey, honey. Thomas's voice came through, sounding bright and distant, filtered through the hum of a hotel lobby in Providence. I just got back to the room. The meetings went great. Providence is quiet this time of year. Very peaceful. Thomas, Alara croaked, her voice barely a thread. Thomas, please, I'm sick. The fever. It's worse. And the cabbages. There are 300, Thomas. I'm alone in the dark. Please tell me to come inside. Please tell me it doesn't matter. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of a television being muted. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was laced with that familiar, patronizing softness that had once comforted her, but now felt like a suffocating shroud. Oh, honey, I know it's a lot. My mother mentioned she was leaving the shipment. Look, I know she can be intense. She's old-fashioned, Alara. She just wants you to understand the weight of our traditions. She believes it builds character. Character? Alara sobbed, her legs shaking so violently she had to sit on a salt sack. I'm dying out here, Thomas. You're just tired, Alara. Don't exaggerate. Look, just push through it. Do it for the family. Do it so there's no friction when they get back. Tell you what, once I'm back from Providence, I'll stop by that boutique you like on Newbury Street. I'll buy you that designer leather bag you were looking at. How does that sound? A little reward for being such a trooper? Alara stared at the wall of green, her eyes wide and glassy. He hadn't heard her. Or worse, he had heard her and decided that her agony was worth a leather handbag. He was her unlikely hero, the man who was supposed to save her, but he was choosing the side of the oppressor. Thomas? She whispered. Yeah, babe. The bag, it wouldn't fit my soul. It's too small. What was that? The connection is getting spotty. Anyway, I've got an early start tomorrow. Love you, trooper. You've got this. The call ended with a hollow click. Alara looked at the phone in her hand. It was a bridge to a man who didn't exist, the version of Thomas she had invented to survive. The weight of his indifference was the final justice and redemption catalyst. She realized then that there would be no rescue from the men or women of the Harrison house. Her hand opened and the expensive smartphone slipped through her numb fingers. It fell with a splash into a galvanized tub filled with slushy ice water and cabbage scraps. She watched the screen flicker once, a pale blue light beneath the dark water, before it died completely. She stood up, the fever surging, her heart vowing a silent, cold rebellion. She was alone in the fog, but for the first time, she knew exactly who her enemies were. The clock tower in the distance struck 4 in the morning, a mournful, metallic sound that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of Alara's bones. She had lost track of the hours, or perhaps the hours had simply dissolved into the gray, freezing mist that now filled the courtyard. 20 hours. For 20 hours she had stood, knelt, and hauled. Her world had narrowed to a singular, agonizing focus: the green leaves, the white salt, and the numbing cold. Her hands no longer felt like part of her body. They were heavy, throbbing weights, swollen so severely that her wedding ring, a thin band of Harrison gold, bit deep into her flesh, creating a ring of angry purple. The skin was translucent and raw, mapped with 100 tiny fissures where the brine had found its way into her blood. She tried to curl her fingers, but they remained stiff, like the frozen branches of the elm tree looming over the fence. Officer Miller, a graveyard shift patrolman with a weary smile and a thermos of black coffee that never quite stays hot enough. He is a man who has seen much of the city's hidden sadness and prefers the quiet of the pre-dawn streets. At the edge of the alley, the slow crawl of a patrol car's headlights swept across the brickwork. Officer Miller slowed his vehicle, peering through the iron gate. He saw a shadow moving, a frail, swaying figure draped in a wet wool robe, surrounded by stacks of white tubs. He considered stopping, but the Harrison estate was known for its rigid privacy and its influential connections. He saw the woman lift a final, massive head of cabbage with a grace that looked like slow-motion prayer, or perhaps slow-motion surrender. Assuming it was just a dedicated servant of a wealthy house, he tipped his cap to the empty air and drove on, the red taillights vanishing into the fog. Alara didn't see him. Her vision was beginning to fray at the edges, darkened by vignette shadows of exhaustion. Every time she blinked, the darkness lingered a second longer. Then the sky began to change. The heavy, damp mist crystallized. Tiny, jagged flakes of white began to drift down from the void. The first real snow of the season. It fell in a silent, beautiful assault, landing on Alara's hair, her eyelashes, and the thin, shaking expanse of her shoulders. Within minutes, she was being glazed in white, a living statue of salt and ice. In her fevered mind, the Boston courtyard began to transform. The brick walls stretched into ancient, gnarled oaks. The stacks of plastic tubs became tombstones of ice. She felt herself slipping into the stories her father used to read to her, the ones about children abandoned in the deep, dark woods, left with nothing but breadcrumbs that the birds had already eaten. "I am the girl in the forest," she thought, her internal voice sounding thin and distant, like a radio station losing its signal. "I am waiting for the light, but the moon has gone to sleep." She dragged the final tub toward the cellar stairs. It was done. 300 heads of cabbage were cleaned, halved, salted, and stacked. The miracle faith-based hook that Beatrice so often used to justify her demands had been fulfilled. But Alara felt no restoration of faith. She felt only a hollow, echoing void where her spirit used to reside. She had given everything, her health, her dignity, her very warmth, to satisfy a tradition that did not love her back. She reached the center of the yard, intending to go inside, but her legs suddenly felt as though they were made of water. Her equilibrium shattered. The gray sky and the white ground swapped places in a sickening whirl. Alara collapsed. She hit the freezing cement with a dull thud, her knees and elbows striking the ice-film ground. The cold of the pavement was a shock, yet strangely, it felt like a bed. She couldn't find the strength to lift her head. She lay there, her cheek pressed against the grit and the salt, watching the snowflakes dance in the yellow glow of the porch light. Her breath was coming out in faint, ghostly plumes, each one smaller than the last. Suddenly, a phantom vibration rattled against her hip. Her old phone was dead in the tub, but her tablet, left on the patio table hours ago, chimed with a relentless, cheerful ping. The screen lit up, cutting through the darkness. It was a message in the family group chat, a digital intrusion into her dying silence. Clara Harrison. The hot springs are absolutely divine tonight. The water is like liquid silk. We're having champagne by the fire now. Ilara, I hope you're working hard. Make sure that kimchi is perfect, or mother will have your head. Don't forget the extra ginger. Enjoy the snow. Attached was a photo, Clara and Beatrice, their faces glowing with health and expensive skincare, holding crystal flutes filled with bubbling gold, their backgrounds a lush, heated paradise of stone and steam. Ilara looked at the glowing screen from her place on the frozen ground. The justice and redemption hook felt like a cruel joke. There was no punishment for the wicked, only champagne. There was no reward for the good, only the cement. She tried to reach for the tablet, perhaps to scream into the digital void, but her hand wouldn't move. Her fingers remained frozen in the shape of a claw, a testament to the labor that had broken her. The light of the screen reflected in her glassy eyes, a tiny mocking spark of a world she no longer belonged to. The snow continued to fall, faster now, beginning to cover her wet robe in a shroud of white. The transformation hook was complete, but it was not the healing journey she had hoped for. It was a descent. Her eyelids grew heavy, heavier than the tub she had moved. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of a snowplow, the rustle of the wind, faded into a soft white static. Just a moment of rest, she whispered, though no sound left her lips. Ilara closed her eyes. Her shallow, ragged breath hitched once, twice, and then slowed to a nearly imperceptible rhythm. Surrounded by the fruits of her agonizing labor, the daughter-in-law of the House of Harrison lay forgotten in the Boston night, a silent voice lost in a world of ice. The Amtrak train from Providence cut through the pre-dawn darkness, its rhythmic clattering against the rails sounding to Thomas like a steady, upbeat pulse. He stared out the window at the blurred landscape, a small velvet box tucked safely in his coat pocket. His meetings had ended early, and a rare pang of guilt, prompted perhaps by the hollow tone in Ilara's voice during their last call, had driven him to catch the first train back to Boston. He imagined her surprise, the way her eyes would light up, and how he would lead her away from those cursed cabbages and into a warm bath. The walk from South Station to Beacon Hill was brisk. The fog had surrendered to a thick, silent blanket of snow that muffled the world, making the city feel like a vast, empty cathedral. As he turned the corner onto their street, Thomas frowned. The house was dark, save for the flickering glow of the backyard porch light. No warmth radiated from the windows. No smell of morning coffee drifted from the vents. "Ilara?" he called out softly as he unlocked the heavy oak front door. Silence greeted him. A cold, heavy silence that tasted of copper and dread. He moved toward the kitchen, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. The back door stood slightly ajar, a dusting of snow accumulating on the hardwood floor inside. He pushed it open, and the breath was torn from his lungs. The courtyard looked like a battlefield of green and white, and there, in the center of it all, was a small, pale mound, half covered in snow. "Ilara!" Thomas scrambled across the icy pavement, his polished leather shoes slipping. He fell to his knees beside the silent form of his wife. She was so still, her skin a terrifying shade of translucent blue, her eyelashes frosted with ice. He scooped her into his arms, and a jagged cry of horror escaped him. She was a furnace wrapped in ice, her skin burning with a lethal fever while her core remained dangerously cold. "No, no, no, Ilara, please," he sobbed, his hands fumbling for his phone. He didn't look at the cabbages. He didn't look at the neatly stacked tubs that represented the death of her spirit. He only saw the woman he had promised to protect, now brittle as glass in his arms. "Dispatch, I need an ambulance. Beacon Hill, my wife. She's not waking up. Please hurry." The sirens that soon tore through the quiet of Beacon Hill were the first sounds of justice and redemption in a house that had long ignored its own rot. Dr. Eris Thorne, a senior attending physician at Massachusetts General, with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like gravel over velvet. He is a man whose patience for domestic negligence is non-existent, The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and artificial lemons. Thomas sat on a plastic chair, his head in his hands, the velvet box in his pocket feeling like a lead weight. Hours had bled into a singular, agonizing blur of white coats and hushed whispers. Finally, the heavy doors of the ICU swung open, and Dr. Thorne stepped out, his expression as grim as the winter sky. "Mr. Harrison?" the doctor asked, his eyes tracking the tremors in Thomas's hands. Is she okay?" Thomas stood, his voice cracking. "Your wife is suffering from severe lobar pneumonia and acute physical exhaustion. Her body has essentially shut down from the inside out," Dr. Thorne said, his tone clipped and professional. "But what concerns me more, Mr. Harrison, are her hands." Thomas blinked, confused. "Her hands. Come with me." Inside the room, Ilara looked small beneath the mountain of heated blankets. An oxygen mask obscured half her face, its rhythmic hissing the only sign of life. Dr. Thorne pulled back the sheet to reveal her hands resting on pillows. They were swathed in thick bandages, but the parts that were visible were swollen to twice their size, the skin mottled and raw. "The brine and the cold have caused significant tissue damage," Thorne continued, his voice dropping an octave. "I noticed old calluses under the new blisters. This wasn't one night of work. This was prolonged, systemic strain. I understand she was quite a pianist once." Thomas looked down, a memory hitting him like a physical blow. He remembered Ilara at the Steinway in their living room, her fingers dancing over the keys, playing Chopin with a lightness that made the world feel bright. He hadn't heard her play in 3 years. He realized now with a sickening jolt that he had watched her hands slowly transform from those of an artist into those of a servant, and he had said nothing. I didn't realize it had gone this far," Thomas whispered, a silent voice of regret screaming in his mind. "Realization usually comes too late in these cases," Thorne replied coldly, turning to check the IV drip. "She needs absolute rest, no visitors other than yourself. And frankly, she needs a reason to want to wake up." Thomas sat by her bed for hours, holding her bandaged hand with the gentleness one would accord to a wounded bird. He looked at her pale face and realized that his unlikely hero status had been a fraud. He had been a bystander in his own marriage. The silence was shattered by the shrill, demanding ring of his phone. He pulled it out, his blood turning to vinegar when he saw the caller ID. "Mother," he answered, but he didn't speak. "Thomas, are you at the house?" Beatrice's voice was sharp, cutting through the sterile quiet of the hospital room. There was no greeting, no warmth. "We've just crossed the border back into Massachusetts. The traffic is abysmal. Why is the house phone going straight to voicemail? And tell Ilara that if she hasn't finished the ginger paste for the second ferment, she'll have to stay up and do it tonight. I want the kitchen pristine when I walk in. Thomas, are you listening?" Thomas looked at Ilara. He looked at the oxygen mask. He looked at the bandages that hid the hands he had once loved. The transformation hook was finally taking hold of him, but it wasn't a miracle of faith. It was a miracle of fury. "Thomas," Beatrice snapped, "why is the house so dark? I'm looking at the remote security feed, and the porch light is the only thing on. Has that girl fallen asleep? The kimchi must be moved to the cellar immediately, or the temperature shift will—" "Beatrice," Thomas said. He didn't call her mother. His voice was flat, a dead thing. "Don't take that tone with me, Thomas. I asked you a question. Is the kimchi finished?" Thomas felt a strange, cold clarity wash over him. He thought of the 300 cabbages. He thought of Ilara lying in the snow. He thought of the champagne flutes in the photo Clara had sent. "Ilara is in the ICU, Beatrice," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. There was a brief pause on the other end, but only a brief one. "The ICU, whatever for? She was just a bit sniffly when we left. Honestly, the youth today have no constitution. I suppose this means the cellar is empty then? Who is going to move the tubs? Clara can't do it. Her back is—" "Beatrice," Thomas interrupted, his voice rising in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew him. "Shut up." The silence on the other end was absolute. Beatrice Harrison had likely never been told to shut up in her entire 70 years of life. "Thomas, how dare you?" "No, Beatrice. How dare you?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on Alara's closed lids. How dare you treat a human being like a piece of equipment? How dare you leave a sick woman to die in the snow for the sake of a tradition that you've turned into a weapon? Now listen here. I did nothing but provide her with a... The house is dark, Beatrice, because no one is there, Thomas said, his hand tightening around the phone. And it's going to stay dark. I'm hanging up now. Do not call me again. Do not come to this hospital. If you or Clara even attempt to enter this floor, I will have security remove you. You wouldn't dare. I am your mother. You were a mother, Thomas said. Now you're just a stranger with a house full of rotting cabbage. He didn't wait for a response. He pressed end, and then, with a hand that didn't tremble, he powered the phone off. He set it on the nightstand and turned back to Alara. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't a burden, it was a shield. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, the heat of the fever still there, but her breath seemed, just for a second, a little deeper. I'm here, Alara, he whispered. The wall is gone. I'm finally here. The white walls of the recovery ward were a stark, sterile canvas that offered no comfort to the woman lying beneath the thin cotton sheets. Alara had returned from the brink of the frozen abyss, but the woman who woke up was not the Alara who had lived in the Harrison townhouse. The fever had broken, leaving her body weak, but something else had shattered deep within her spirit. When she finally opened her eyes, Thomas was there, leaning forward with a look of desperate hope. He reached for her hand, the one that wasn't attached to an IV drip. But Alara did not flinch, nor did she welcome the touch. She simply stared through him, her eyes as vacant and gray as the Boston fog. Alara, honey, it's me. You're safe now, Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't blink. Her lips, once so quick to offer a comforting word or a soft song, remained pressed together in a thin, bloodless line. It was a silent voice hook in its most tragic form, a soul that had retreated so far into the fortress of its own trauma that language could no longer reach it. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a neuropsychologist with a gentle, melodic voice and a penchant for wearing colorful scarves that contrast with the grim nature of her work. She specializes in trauma-induced mutism. Dr. Jenkins stood at the foot of the bed, observing the lack of interaction. It's a protective mechanism, Mr. Harrison, she explained later in the hallway. Her brain has associated vocalization and emotional output with pain and labor. Right now, her silence is the only thing she truly owns. She isn't just physically exhausted, she is experiencing a total collapse of her sense of self. Thomas looked through the glass partition at his wife. She was staring at a single snowflake melting against the window pane. He realized then that he couldn't take her back to the red brick house on Beacon Hill. That house was a mausoleum of her happiness. I'm taking her away, Thomas said, more to himself than to the doctor. I have a small apartment in Providence, near the university. It's quiet. There are trees. No one there knows the name Harrison. While the silence deepened in the hospital, a storm of a different kind was brewing back at the Harrison estate. Beatrice and Clara had arrived home to find the iron gates locked and the house feeling like a tomb. As they entered through the kitchen, the smell hit them first, a pungent, sour stench that made Clara gag. In the center of the courtyard, the 300 cabbages that Alara had worked so hard to salt were beginning to rot. Without the secondary ferment, without the constant care of a servant to monitor the temperature and the brine, the gift from God had turned into a swamp of decaying vegetation. The snow had melted slightly and then refrozen, trapping the rotting greens in a gray, slushy filth. "This is unacceptable," Beatrice shrieked, her cane thumping violently against the slate floor. "Where is she? Why hasn't this been moved? The smell is leaching into the upholstery." Mrs. Gable, the Harrisons' longtime neighbor from the opposite side, a woman who had spent years silently judging the family's treatment of Alara. She stood on her balcony now, watching the chaos with a grim sense of satisfaction. "She's not coming back, Beatrice," Mrs. Gable called out over the fence, her voice dripping with disdain. "I saw the ambulance. You should be ashamed, leaving that poor girl out there. The whole neighborhood is talking." Beatrice ignored her, turning her fury on Clara. "Well, don't just stand there with your hand over your nose. Get a shovel. We have to clear this before the health inspectors are called." "Me? Clara recoiled, her manicured hands trembling. Mother, I don't even know how to use a shovel. That's what Alara is for. I have a brunch at the club in an hour. There is no Alara, and there is no brunch, Beatrice barked. For the first time, the unlikely hero of the house, the labor itself, was absent. Without Alara to act as the buffer between them and the mundane realities of life, the two women began to claw at each other. They didn't know how to operate the heavy-duty dishwasher. They didn't know which key opened the cellar. They didn't even know how to make a pot of coffee without it tasting like burnt dirt. The house, once a symbol of prestige, began to feel like a rotting cage. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere in the Providence apartment was hushed but peaceful. Thomas had moved Alara in the middle of the night to avoid any confrontation. He had traded his tailored suits for soft sweaters and spent his days working remotely, his eyes never leaving the woman who sat by the window. Alara still hadn't spoken. She moved like a ghost, eating only when prompted, her bandaged hands resting uselessly in her lap. But there was a transformation hook beginning in the way she watched the birds in the park across the street. She was no longer a Harrison. She was a woman waiting for her own spring. A heavy thud at the door interrupted the quiet. A courier delivered a large reinforced box addressed to Beatrice Harrison, care of the estate. Thomas had prepared it with a surgical precision that matched his mother's coldness. Inside the box, he had placed every single hospital bill, the ICU costs, the specialist fees, the physical therapy invoices, all totaling an astronomical sum. Beside the bills lay a legal document, a formal petition for legal separation, a precursor to the divorce papers he intended to serve once Alara was strong enough to sign them. But the centerpiece of the box was a photograph. It was a close-up of Alara's hands in the hospital, raw and ruined, the wedding ring cutting into the swollen flesh. Across the back of the photo, Thomas had written in bold black ink, "You wanted the tradition preserved at all costs. Here is the cost. You didn't just want kimchi, Mother. You wanted to see if you could break her. You succeeded. You have killed the soul of the woman I loved. Do not seek us. From this day on, you have no son." When the package arrived at Beacon Hill, Clara opened it first. She screamed at the sight of the photo. Beatrice, however, simply stared at the bills and the legal papers. For a moment, the iron mask of the matriarch flickered. The silence of the house, now filled with the faint scent of rotting cabbage that they could never quite scrub away, felt like a curse. The justice and redemption hook was in motion. The Harrison name was no longer a shield. It was a brand. Back in Providence, Thomas sat on the floor by Alara's feet. He didn't ask her to speak. He didn't ask her to forgive him. He simply leaned his head against her knee. Alara's hands, still stiff and scarred, moved fractionally. Her fingers brushed the top of his hair, a tiny silent movement. It wasn't a conversation, but it was the first sign that the woman inside the ice was still there, listening to the silence. Providence in late winter was a city of soft edges and long shadows. Unlike the rigid, towering brick of Beacon Hill, the neighborhood where Thomas and Alara now lived felt lived in and breathing. The air smelled of wood smoke and the briny promise of the Narragansett Bay. For Alara, the silence was no longer a cage, but a cocoon. She moved through the small apartment with a ghost-like grace, her bandaged hands finally replaced by thin, silver scars, reminders of the GD techniques of suffering she had endured. Her voice remained locked away, a silent voice that transcended language, yet her eyes had begun to regain their luster. It was a transformation hook, a slow, healing journey from pain toward a happiness she hadn't dared to imagine. The breakthrough didn't happen in a doctor's office. It happened at the West End Community Garden, a patch of earth nestled between two Victorian houses, where the soil was being prepped for the spring. Thomas had led her there one afternoon, hoping the fresh air would stir something in her soul. Alara knelt by a raised bed, her fingers touching the cold, dark earth. For years, her labor had been a burden, a justice and redemption debt she felt she owed to a family that never loved her. But here, the dirt didn't demand, it invited. Henry Vance, a 70-year-old Vietnam veteran with a prosthetic leg and a laugh that sounds like gravel crunched under a boot. He wears a faded military cap and has a profound, quiet wisdom born from surviving the unthinkable. Henry was leaning on a garden hoe when he first saw her. He didn't ask her name, or why she was staring at the dormant kale. He simply handed her a trowel. "Soil's a bit stubborn this time of year," Henry remarked, his voice a warm baritone. "Just like people. Takes a lot of turning to get the bitterness out so something sweet can grow." Over the next few weeks, Henry became the unlikely hero of Ilara's quiet world. They worked in a rhythmic silence that suited them both. Henry spoke of the jungles he had left behind and the friends he had lost to time and war. He shared stories of loss, and in the space between his words, Ilara found solace for her own. One Tuesday, as the first pale green shoots of spring onions poked through the frost, Henry looked at Ilara's scarred hands. "You know, Ilara, the hardest winters make the strongest oaks. Trees need the cold to go deep into the ground. They need the winter to be strong enough for the spring. And so do you." Ilara looked at her hands. For the first time, she didn't see the cost Beatrice had exacted. She saw tools. That evening, Ilara did something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. She went to the small kitchen and pulled out a single head of cabbage she had bought at the local market. There was no mountain of 300 crates. There was no freezing fog. There was only the soft light of their Providence home. She began to make kimchi, but this was different. She wasn't following the rigid, salt-heavy Harrison family manual. She added pears for sweetness, toasted sesame for depth, and a dash of honey. Every movement was a call to faith, an invitation to herself to engage with a life she had almost lost. She was making it for herself, for Thomas, and for Henry. Thomas watched from the doorway, tears pricking his eyes. The woman who had been broken by labor was now using that same labor to heal. It was a miracle faith-based hook in action. Not a miracle of God's decree, but a miracle of a woman restoring her own faith in life. As the weeks passed, Ilara began to hum. It wasn't a song yet, just a low, vibrating note that filled the kitchen as she packed small jars with her vibrant, spicy creations. She took a jar to Henry, who ate it with a crust of bread and declared it the taste of survival. The transformation hook reached its peak on a Saturday morning in April. The community garden was in full bloom. Ilara was kneeling among the radishes, her face tilted up toward the sun. Henry said something particularly grumbly about the price of fertilizer, and suddenly the silence broke. Ilara laughed. It wasn't the quiet, suppressed titter of the Harrison house. It was a bright, melodic sound that rang through the garden like a silver bell. Thomas, standing by the fence, caught his breath. He instinctively pulled out his phone. He didn't mean to be an intruder. He just wanted to capture the emotion-based shock of seeing his wife alive again. He filmed her as she stood up, a basket of fresh greens in her arms, her face glowing with a genuine, unburdened smile as she joked with Henry. That night, Thomas looked at the footage. He thought of all the older women who followed his mother's social circles, women who lived under the weight of tradition and duty. He thought of the justice and redemption Ilara deserved. He uploaded the video to a small blog he had started to document their move. He titled it, Han Trin Tim Lainukoi, The Journey to Finding a Smile. She didn't speak a word for months, he wrote in the caption, using a transformation hook to draw viewers in. She had forgotten how to breathe, but the garden didn't care about her name or her past. It only cared about her care. Today, Ilara came back to us. By Sunday morning, the video had been shared 10 times. By Monday, 1,000. By Wednesday, it had gone viral across the New England area. Thousands of women, many of them older and religious, were moved by the silent voice of Ilara's journey. They saw their own daughters, their own sisters, or their younger selves in her weary but triumphant eyes. Comments flooded in. If you believe God led her to this garden, comment, Amen. A wounded soul found a way to save herself. What happened next broke my heart but gave me hope. Ilara sat at the small kitchen table, Thomas showing her the screen. She saw the thousands of amens and the stories of other women who had felt invisible. She didn't look back at Boston. She looked at the small jar of kimchi on the table, then at her husband. Thomas, she said, her voice raspy but clear. It was her first word in months. Yes, Ilara. We're going to need more jars. The unlikely hero had finally stepped out of the shadow of the Harrison Wall, and the world was waiting to taste her resilience. The red brick townhouse on Beacon Hill, once a fortress of prestige and cold order, had begun to smell of damp dust and neglected corners. Without the invisible labor of Ilara, the Harrison kingdom was not just crumbling, it was rotting from the inside out. The grand piano remained closed, its mahogany surface coated in a fine gray film, while the kitchen, the heart of Ilara's former servitude, had become a wasteland of scorched pans and expired milk. Beatrice Harrison sat in her high-backed velvet chair, but her posture, once as rigid as a military officer's, had begun to slouch. Her eyes, which used to scan the room for the slightest speck of dust, now often fixed on the far wall with a terrifying, blank intensity. Dr. Julian Vance, a neurologist with a clinical but not unkind demeanor, who carries a heavy leather briefcase and wears a scent of peppermint to mask the hospital smells that cling to him. It's early-onset vascular dementia, exacerbated by acute stress, Dr. Vance explained to a frantic Clara in the hallway. She is losing her grasp on the present. She will increasingly retreat into a version of the past where she felt most in control. The diagnosis was a justice and redemption hook that neither woman was prepared for. As the fog settled in Beatrice's mind, her demands didn't stop. They simply became untethered from reality. She would wake at 3 in the morning, banging her cane on the floor, shrieking for Ilara to bring her tea, to starch the linens, or, most obsessively, to check the temperature of the fermenting tubs that were no longer there. "Where is that girl?" Beatrice would mutter, her voice cracking. "The ginger is too thick. Ilara, the salt is drying on the leaves. Tell her to move faster." Clara, meanwhile, was facing a different kind of ruin. Used to an endless stream of allowances managed by Thomas, she found herself staring at past due notices from every luxury boutique on Newbury Street. Without Thomas to balance the ledgers, her credit cards snapped like dry twigs under the weight of her vanity. "I can't live like this, Mother," Clara cried, looking at a pile of bills. "The gardener quit, the cleaning service is suing us for back pay, and Thomas won't even pick up the phone." It was then that Clara saw the video, the one that had gone viral. She saw Ilara, her sister-in-law, her servant, smiling in a sun-drenched garden in Providence, looking more radiant and alive than she ever had in Boston. The transformation hook of Ilara's joy was a bitter pill for Clara to swallow. "Providence," Clara whispered, a predatory glint in her eyes. "She's in Providence. If we can get her back, Thomas will follow. He won't let his precious Ilara work for us if he's paying for her, but if she's there, things can go back to how they were." The train ride from Boston to Providence was a silent affair. Beatrice drifted in and out of lucidity, while Clara clutched her designer handbag, now one of the last few she hadn't sold to pay the electric bill. They were coming not with an apology, but with a demand disguised as a plea, a silent voice tactic of manipulation. They found the address Thomas had used on the legal papers. It was a modest Victorian house with a wraparound porch and a small sign in the window. Ilara's Small Batch Ferments. Ilara was on the porch, labeling jars with Henry Vance. When the black town car pulled up, she didn't flinch. She didn't drop her pen. The unlikely hero of her own life stood her ground, her back straight and her eyes clear. "Ilara!" Clara called out as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her voice pitched in a high, artificial trill of sisterly affection. "Oh, thank God we found you. It's been a nightmare, an absolute nightmare." Thomas stepped out from the doorway, his arm instinctively moving to Ilara's waist, but she gently placed a hand on his arm, signaling that she didn't need a shield. "Not today." "What are you doing here, Clara?" Thomas asked, his voice like flint. "Thomas, please, look at Mother." Clara gestured to the car, where Beatrice was being helped out by the driver. The matriarch looked frail, her expensive wool coat hanging off her thin shoulders. "She's sick, Thomas. She has dementia. She calls for Ilara every night. She won't eat anything unless she thinks Ilara made it. We're family. Surely you can't leave us to suffer like this?" Beatrice approached the porch steps, her eyes fluttering as they landed on Ilara. For a second, the iron mask returned. "The cabbage, Ilara," she croaked. "You left it in the rain. Come home and fix it. There is work to be done." It was a miracle faith-based hook attempt, using the duty of the daughter-in-law to invoke a religious empathy or a sense of guilt. Clara stepped closer, her eyes brimming with practiced tears. "Chi dao lam on, chi langwoy duin hat ko the chumsok mi, im sagiup chi, im hua, Shi ken shi kwe beacon hill, mwatu se juok shoabo. Shungta sila mot gia jin han fuchlan nua. Ilara looked at Clara, then at the woman who had left her to freeze in the snow. She remembered the emotion-based hook of her own heartbreak. She felt the scars on her hands, those silent voices of her past, throb once and then go still. I am not going back, Ilara said. Her voice was steady, a silent voice that had finally found its true strength. I am not a Harrison daughter. I was never your family. I was your ghost. Ilara, don't be cruel, Clara snapped, her mask slipping. Think of the tradition. Think of mother's health. I am thinking of health, Ilara replied. My own. I have learned to love myself, Clara. And that love doesn't have room for your house. Ilara turned to a small crate on the porch table. She picked up a jar of her newest kimchi, the one she had made with Henry, flavored with the sweetness of spring. She walked down the steps and placed it into Beatrice's trembling hands. This is the last thing I will ever give you, Ilara said. It is made with the hands you tried to break. Drink the broth. It will help your breath, as you always said. Clara grabbed Ilara's wrist. You can't just leave us. The debt, Ilara. The boutiques, the house taxes. I'm going to lose everything. Ilara didn't pull away. She looked Clara in the eye with a profound, terrifying pity. Because of the mercy of God, and because I didn't want Thomas to carry the shame of your ruin, I have already settled it, Ilara said quietly. I used the first profits from my shop and the savings my own parents left me. Your boutique debts are gone, Clara. Your house is safe for one more year. Clara's jaw dropped. The justice and redemption hook had swung in a direction she never expected. But that is the end, Ilara continued, her voice rising so the whole street could hear. I have paid for my freedom with the gold of my labor. I have honored your tradition one last time by sacrificing for people who didn't deserve it. Now go. Never come to Providence again. Never call my husband. From this moment, the Harrisons are a memory I have chosen to forget. Thomas stepped forward, his face etched with pride. You heard her. The car is waiting. Beatrice looked down at the jar in her hands, her eyes clouding over again. Ilara, she whispered, the name a hollow shell. Goodbye, Beatrice, Ilara said. As the town car pulled away, Ilara stood on the porch, her hand resting on the wooden railing. She didn't feel the weight of the past anymore. The justice and redemption hook was complete, not through fire, but through a cold, hard boundary. Henry Vance stepped up beside her, tipping his cap toward the retreating car. Hard winter's over, kid. The roots are deep enough now. Ilara smiled, and for the first time, the smile reached all the way to her soul. The air in Providence on Christmas Eve was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and the distant salty breath of the Atlantic. Unlike the suffocating heavy fog of Boston, this cold felt clean, a sharp, clarifying winter that didn't bite but rather invigorated. The cobblestone streets were dusted with a light powdery snow, reflecting the warm amber glow from the storefront of Ilara's small batch ferments. Inside, the shop was a sanctuary of glass jars and earthy aromas. Ilara stood behind the counter, her movements steady and sure. The Goshno Kwa Ilara, Ilara's small corner, was more than a business. It was a testament to her survival. The shelves were lined with her signature kimchi, no longer a burden of 300 heads of cabbage, but a craft born of love and a transformation hook that had turned pain into purpose. She had moved away from the rigid, punishing recipes of the Harrisons, infusing her ferments with ingredients that celebrated her own journey. Ginger for strength, honey for the sweetness of freedom, and peppers for the fire of her newfound voice. Father Brennan, a local priest with a penchant for historical novels and a gentle soul. He often stops by the shop not just for the ferments, but for the peaceful atmosphere Ilara has cultivated. Merry Christmas, Ilara, Father Brennan said, tucking a jar into his coat. The community is talking about your holiday baskets. You've brought something special to Providence, a taste of resilience. Ilara smiled, her eyes bright and clear. Thank you, Father. It's just food made with a bit of peace. As the open sign was flipped to closed, Thomas entered, shaking the snow from his heavy wool coat. He didn't look like the weary, passive man of Boston anymore. He walked with a renewed sense of grounding, his eyes immediately finding Ilara. Their relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of justice and redemption, not through grand gestures, but through the hard daily work of respect. They had learned a silent voice of their own, the ability to understand each other's needs without the pressure of family expectations. "Ready to head home?" Thomas asked, leaning over the counter to kiss her cheek. "Henry's already there. He's arguing with the fireplace again." Home was no longer a tomb of silver and tradition. It was a cozy apartment where the walls were decorated with art they had chosen together, and the air was filled with the sound of Ilara's humming. The piano, which had remained silent for years in Beacon Hill, now stood in their living room, its keys often dancing under Ilara's scarred but capable fingers. The small dining table was set for three. There was no elaborate memorial service, no dozens of distant relatives demanding to be served. Instead, there was a simple, hearty stew, fresh bread, and a small bowl of Ilara's finest kimchi. Henry Vance, Ilara's garden mentor and unlikely savior. His presence at the table was a reminder that family is often chosen in the trenches of healing. "I've spent 60 years eating military rations and lonely dinners," Henry grumbled, though his eyes twinkled. "I suppose I can tolerate one night of good company and even better food." They sat by the crackling fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Ilara didn't spend the night in the kitchen. She sat with them, sharing stories and laughter. She was no longer the invisible laborer. She was the heart of the home. She realized that her call to faith hadn't been about a religion of duty, but a faith in the human spirit's ability to bloom after a long winter. As the night deepened, Thomas took Ilara's hand. "Do you ever miss it? The old house?" Ilara looked into the fire, her mind drifting back to the 300 heads of cabbage in the Boston fog. "I miss the woman I thought I was supposed to be," she said quietly, "but I love the woman I am now. The pain was just the salt, Thomas. It helped me ferment into something stronger." Miles away in a quiet, high-end care facility nestled in the hills of Massachusetts, the kingdom of Beatrice Harrison had shrunk to a single, sterile room. The halls were decorated with tinsel, but for Beatrice, the world was a shifting landscape of half-forgotten faces and voices from the past. Nurse Elena, a compassionate woman with infinite patience who has seen the rise and fall of many great families. She is the one who currently holds the keys to Beatrice's daily world. Nurse Elena entered the room with a small tray. "Merry Christmas, Beatrice. Look, a special delivery arrived today. No return address, just a jar of that kimchi you like." Beatrice looked up, her eyes clouded with the silent voice of her dementia. She didn't recognize the name on the jar, but as Elena placed a small piece of the fermented cabbage on a cracker and offered it to her, something happened. The emotion-based hook of the taste, the sharp ginger, the depth of the salt, the unmistakable signature of Ilara's hand, pierced through the fog of her mind. For one crystalline minute, Beatrice Harrison was back in her kitchen. She saw the snow. She saw the girl in the yard. She saw the ruined hands. A single heavy tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the deep wrinkles of her cheek. It was a moment of justice and redemption that required no court, only a conscience. "Shinloi Khan," she whispered, her voice a mere ghost of its former authority. "I'm sorry, my child." The lucidity vanished as quickly as it had arrived, the fog swallowing her again. But the tear remained, a wet mark on her silk robe, a late, lonely apology that finally closed the ledger of the past. Back in Providence, the clock struck midnight. Ilara stood by the window, watching the snow fall in large, lazy flakes. The city was silent, wrapped in a peaceful Sabbath. She looked at her hands. The scars were still there, faint silver lines that mapped her history. They were no longer marks of shame or unlikely hero burdens. They were her story. She had taken the emotion-based shock of her suffering and used it as the soil for her new life. The 300 heads of cabbage was no longer a nightmare. It was the transformation hook that had freed her. She had survived the winter, and in doing so, she had learned that the most important miracle wasn't the work itself, but the strength to walk away from the work that kills the soul. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "The snow," Ilara said, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "It's so quiet tonight. No wind, no fog. It's a new year, Alara. Yes, she whispered, a call to faith in her heart. A new year. And for the first time, I can hear the music. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white. But inside the small apartment in Providence, the room was filled with the warmth of an unlikely hero who had finally found her way home. The banjo huang was complete, and the melody was one of peace. The story of Alara reminds us that our worth is not measured by how much we can endure for those who do not value us, but by the courage we find to value ourselves. True tradition should never be a cage, and love should never be a sacrifice that requires the death of your spirit. Sometimes the hardest winter of our lives is exactly what we need to grow deep roots and find a voice that no longer whispers, but sings with strength. Remember, you are a masterpiece of God's creation, not a tool for someone else's convenience. If Alara's journey touched your heart today, please like this video and share it with a woman who might need to know she is not alone in her struggle. If you want to see more stories of resilience, justice, and the power of faith, please comment your thoughts below and subscribe to our channel so we can grow this family of strength together. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the strength you give to those who feel invisible and for the light you shine on the path of the weary. We ask for your special blessing upon every person watching this today. If they are in their own winter, give them the warmth of your love and the courage to find their spring. Restore their faith, heal their wounds, and remind them that they are precious in your sight. If you believe that God still performs miracles and can turn any pain into a new beginning, please write Amen in the comments below.